Howdy Hokies, welcome to day 12. This video lesson corresponds to chapter 5 as we continue our examination of 4 perspectives on the nature of persuasion. Chapter 5, of course, looking at persuasion from the standpoint of sources and the credibility of those sources. So we're going to examine theories and models of source credibility. A way to simplify that is to ask a series of questions. What makes some sources or some people more believable or trustworthy or credible than others? We don't believe everybody. We believe somebody. Why do we believe somebody and not everybody? Among the everybody who's out there persuading corporations, organizations, institutions, departments, small groups, individuals, who's believable and why? That's what we want to know. So to put it into context, remember the last 2 sessions we were thinking about messages. Messages and more specifically reasoning in those messages. So persuasion and reasoning, or persuasion from the standpoint of analysis of the persuasive messages. Today we're looking at persuasion and sources, the sources of persuasion. And thinking about what makes certain persuaders, again, whether they're organizations, entities, or individuals, what makes them persuasive? What do we think about when we say a source is credible? Well, as the authors point out, there are primarily 3 meanings of credibility. The first comes to us from the ancient Greek Aristotle. It is the idea of ethos as good character. And this view of the meaning of credibility is centered in the speaker, the degree to which the speaker can demonstrate, give the impression, create the perception that she or he is a person of good character. A second meaning comes to us from the legal community, the rational or legal idea of credibility. And this is not so much speaker-based as it is evidence-based. We'll look at that in more detail in just a moment. And then finally, social scientific approaches to source credibility that try to better understand, to better measure, if you will, believability. What is it that audiences see in an individual or an institution, an organization, that makes them say, that person or that company is believable? So a shorter session today. I hope you don't mind. I think chapter 5 is fairly straightforward. Of course, that's my perspective, and if you find that it's more obtuse than I'm making it out to be, certainly send me an email or give me a call and let me know. But I think it's fairly straightforward, so we're going to have a shorter session today. I'm throwing some extra examples that the authors don't use, and I'm going to try to see if I can simplify even more than they have in the chapter to give us a better understanding of credibility. Recall that we've talked about Aristotle, and we used this graphic when we were beginning our examination of messages. So the previous 2 sessions we focused more on the logos. This time we're focusing on ethos. What did Aristotle say made a speaker credible or established ethos? It was that speaker's character, the degree to which the speaker could create the perception that he was a person of good character, the degree to which he could create the perception or convince the audience that he was intelligent or knowledgeable about the topic, and then the degree to which he could demonstrate or persuade, create the perception that he had goodwill towards the audience. Well, not to be forgotten, pathos is that idea of appeals to human emotions. And hopefully you can begin to put some of the pieces of the picture together here, that in the messages of persuaders, they can show themselves to be people of character, intelligence, and goodwill. But we can analyze either or separately. And today we'll look at how the ethos of a speaker or entity, an institution, can influence the acceptance of the persuasion when the audience is in agreement with the Logos, and sometimes when they're not knowledgeable enough about the Logos to say they understand or agree with the message, but are persuaded anyway because of the ethos of the speaker. Well, we can think about emotional appeals when people are perhaps suspect, or when someone has perhaps not a reputation that we would agree with, and yet that person is still, to a certain extent, able to have a degree of credibility with a particular audience. We'll look at what some of the pitfalls that celebrities and politicians have fallen into, and how even though they have encountered difficulty, shall we say, personal or professional difficulty, they are still able to rely on their ethos to persuade audiences, or at other times when, again, audiences may not be sympathetic to their messages. When a speaker has a high degree of ethos, they're willing to be persuaded. Only if it was as easy as just breaking these things down and showing how they operate mutually exclusively. But they don't. They influence one another, and in some ways they become like a bit of a spaghetti bowl. They all work together, and we try to tease them out to better understand each aspect. Well, for Aristotle, his concept was that this character, intelligence, and goodwill, combined in the concept of ethos, could only be demonstrated in the act of speaking. Today, on the other hand, we don't tend to believe that. We tend to think more of ethos as being a speaker's reputation. In some ways, that's a good thing. In some ways, that is a bad thing. But just so you're clear on the difference between our contemporary understanding of a speaker's ethos or reputation, it is what precedes a persuader, before the message. So you can see then, in contrast to Aristotle, who said the speaker must, in the act of speaking, establish his ethos, today we can find out information about a speaker, a candidate, a company representative, an organization's representative, find out information about their reputation before we ever hear a persuasive message. And then we can allow that is our understanding of their ethos, to help us be more likely or less likely to be persuaded by the actual message once we are exposed to it. Well, that's the classic tradition. More contemporary is what we call the rational or legal perspective on the credibility of sources. Very different here, because more often than not, we're talking about a forensic setting or a legal setting. And in those settings, there are very formal guidelines for evaluating whether or not a source is credible. These are guidelines that are objective to the individuals making the consideration or making the decision about the credibility of the speaker. They are objective, and they apply to all audiences. So it is not speaker-based as much as it is evidence-based. That is, there are rules and guidelines and ways of thinking about how shall we evaluate the witness, or how shall we evaluate the testimony as to the standard of its credibility. Well, as the authors point out, there are really two aspects to this. One is the ability of the person to speak on the topic, in some ways not that different from what Aristotle said, right? Character, intelligence, and goodwill. Does this individual have the intelligence? Well, intelligence, again, is probably not the best translation. We might say, is this speaker knowledgeable about the topic on which he or she is speaking or seeking to persuade us. Do they have expertise? And this expertise is not always someone who's a doctor or a lawyer or a diplomat. Expertise can come in other forms than these sort of formal credentials. Can come from experience. A person who, say, graduated from college with a biology degree, but decided, I really wasted 4 years of my life, and I don't know what I'm going to do with a biology degree, but I do love photography, and goes on to get a job with National Geographic, taking photographs, traveling around the world and taking photographs for Nat Geo magazine. Well, if we just looked at that person's quote-unquote expertise to tell us about something going on, informing us, persuading us of the importance to learn something more about something going on somewhere else in the world, we might say that person, based on credential, expertise, fails to be credible. But when we find out about their experience, you see, that can change the way we think about their ability. Also, again, as the authors point out, there is a big difference between someone who is reporting something they overheard as testimony in a trial, hearsay evidence, and what is eyewitness testimony. First-hand experience carries much more weight in terms of the standard for credibility than someone who is telling something after the fact or overheard, second-hand information. Well, and then whether or not what is provided here can be supported, can be verified by peers who have similar experience or similar expertise. The person who fits this category, who has the ability to speak about something, is knowledgeable enough to try to persuade us based on expertise, experience, and can be corroborated by people with similar experience, similar expertise, and we say they have a high level of credibility. Objectivity is a bit different because there can be people with a great deal of expertise, professional, great deal of experience, personal, but because of their bias, they may decrease their objectivity, increasing in their subjective interpretations, their bias. Maybe perhaps they're passionate about something. There's nothing wrong with being passionate about something and trying to persuade other people of it. It's just that we know sometimes our passion can cause us to not be as critical in our examination of positions that we hold. So while you may have a high degree of ability to comment on something and to seek to persuade others about it, if you are also very subjective and there is a great deal of bias, those work against each other to cancel each other out. The person who has the higher ability, as well as is more objective or able to be more objective, that is, they're dispassionate. They may be a third party, may be someone who's not involved on either side of a case at court, but can, because of their expertise, speak to one perspective more than the other, and so they're invited to come in and not only offer testimony, but to be examined and to be cross-examined. The idea typically is that if you're a third party, if you're dispassionate or disinterested, or down south we say if you don't have a dog in that fight, that is, say you don't really care who wins, you can tend toward being more objective. Think of it this way. If you were going to talk to people who are going to be watching, say, the March Madness, NCAA basketball championship, or the Super Bowl, or the Major League Baseball World Series, or whatever it is, and you say, well, I'm going to ask 3 different people to analyze who they think is going to win. First person I'm going to ask is a rabid fan of one team. The second person I'm going to ask is a rabid fan of another team. Third person I'm going to ask knows a lot about football, but their team's not in the Super Bowl, and they don't really seem to have any subjective interest either way. Of the three, who's going to be able to provide you a more objective sort of understanding of, well, this team has this thing that they do well, that team has those things that they do well, and so based upon this, looking at these criteria dispassionately, I'm going to predict that that team's going to win. Well, you can see that this is often the standard that we use for the media. We have this idea that we can take these rational or legal standards, probably in this case we would say more rational standards for reporting, if you will, and apply them to news outlets or news reporters. For instance, if you had the option to read a report from someone who was a first-year student in college, and this was the first piece they'd ever written, they're writing it for the CT, versus someone, and so let's say they're writing it on Middle East conflict, right, versus someone who's been working, say, for CNN or Fox, like Christian Amanpour for CNN, or someone who's been working for Fox, and they've been covering the Middle East for 20 years or 30 years. Who has the greater ability, right? Okay, so they have the greater knowledge, expertise, experience to comment on this thing. Well, who is more dispassionate? That is to say, who is able to be more objective? And you'll hear stories of journalists. I know one who is a friend of mine in the department, and this particular faculty member has pointed out that during campaigns, sometimes they don't even vote. And of course, that would make some Americans mad. Say, what do you mean? You're a citizen. You should vote. Well, if the argument goes, if they are involved in a campaign from the standpoint of supporting one candidate, having made up their mind they're going to vote for that particular candidate, and say they're posting things on Facebook in favor of that candidate, critical of another candidate, on their personal Twitter account, whatever it is, you say, well, even if that's personal, right, that somehow biases their objectivity, their ability to report fairly, dispassionately on either of the two candidates, or if there are multiple candidates. So you can see how, this idea of rational standards, even in journalism, where it's not meant to be, or we don't expect it to be persuasion, but fair reporting, fair and balanced, or objective, if you will, that these standards are brought into play. Well, so moving along here, willing and reluctant testimony, if you will. What is willing testimony? Well, to simplify, and again, this is just building upon what the authors provide. Hopefully you have completed chapter 5 by the time you watch this, because if you haven't, it's not going to make nearly as much sense. But building on what they've already provided for you in the reading, what I would say is a way to keep this in mind, the willing versus the reluctant witness, or willing testimony versus reluctant testimony, is simply, say, the employee who's been terminated from a company, and then is very eager to tell people about all the things that are supposedly going on behind the scenes that are unethical or whatever it may be. Say, well, that person is more of a willing witness, because they're not going to be testifying or provide anything to the public or to an audience that is going to damage them in any way. So that's sort of the disgruntled employee. But what does that do to affect the credibility? You say, well, you did, after all, get fired from the company. How credible are the things that you are saying now about the company? Perhaps you are just disgruntled and you want to now damage the company. Well, what about the reluctant testimony, the reluctant witness? There was a movie about this some years ago in the tobacco industry. Say that there is an executive high up in a company who, just for moral reasons, has decided, I'm not going to quit my job yet, anyway, but there are just things going on in the company that I disagree with. They're unethical. I have moral problems with them. Um, and I'm tired of the public being deceived, so I'm going to go public. Well, in that case, we would say that's reluctant testimony. Why? Because this person still works for the company. Maybe they helped build the company, but for whatever reason, as they're providing information about unethical behaviors going on within the company, they can suffer loss. That individual can suffer loss to their reputation, to their livelihood, etc. So what they're sharing is not just going to damage someone else. It may, in fact, bring harm upon themselves to their reputation or financially or whatever it is. That person is going to have a much, much higher degree, we say, for the most part, of credibility than the willing witness. Well, let's move on to this third perspective. What we know about the social scientific approaches to thinking about credibility. If the first is the speaker-based, that is to say, the speaker has his or her reputation that sort of precedes him or her, and the audience can determine whether or not this is a person of good character. The second approach, the legal, the idea there is there are standards, and regardless of how we feel about this particular person, popular in the community, devil in the community, whatever it is, we're all going to abide by these standards and guidelines in judging their credibility. The last approach is this social scientific approach, asking the question, what is it that makes sources believable to audiences? And it's really in many ways all over the board. That is to say, it shifts depending upon the speaker, upon the message, upon the situation. I mean, something as seemingly as harmless as misquoting or misciting, or someone failing to cite some sort of source where they got information. Sometimes individuals who travel to different parts of the country, if they have as part of their native dialect, right, something that is frowned upon in another part of the country, then that can impact their believability. So I'm from Texas, and I don't think I have much of a southern drawl, but let's say I was from Mississippi. And if I was from Mississippi, and I went up to Boston, Quincy Market, but I didn't talk like folks from Boston. I talked real slow, like one of them boys from Mississippi. What will they think of me? Well, maybe not everybody, right? But something as seemingly as harmless as my dialect and my southern drawl, if people attribute that to slowness intellectually, right, that can affect my believability. That is to say, I might not be as believable to some audiences in some regions of the country as I would be to others, simply because of the way I talk. So as much as this is social scientific, I don't want to give the impression, I don't think the authors do either, I don't want to give the impression that we sort of have this down to a science, because one man's trash is another man's treasure, as the old saying goes. What can make a person believable to one audience in one situation might, the very same thing, reduce their believability to another audience in another situation. But we want to know, generally speaking, what does research tell us about when audiences listen to a speaker, why they find them, quote unquote, believable, or this concept of believability? Well, in all the research, the number one thing over and over is the idea of trustworthiness. There are going to be some people who, even though I may have, by my physical appearance, not be attractive, by the way I talk, my dialect, or mistakes I may make in my argument, my efforts to persuade them, dissimilarities in the things that we may already know about each other, maybe ideologically, politically, religiously, socially, where we disagree. The number one thing that at least Americans have said helps them find a source believable is their trustworthiness. If they seem trustworthy, if they appear to be honorable and honest, if they appear to have goodwill towards the audience, trustworthiness. Can I trust this person? Do they seem trustworthy? Then I'm more likely to believe them. Secondly, then, although similarities can make a source more persuasive to her audience, similarities can, because we tend to gravitate to people with whom we have much more in common, right? We know that similarities alone are not enough, right? I mean, think about even in families where these are the people that have known me all my life, the people that have loved me longer than anyone else, the people who know more about me, good, the bad, and the ugly, and love me anyway, right? We don't always agree. I don't know about your family, but not only do we not always agree, sometimes we disagree, and sometimes we vehemently disagree. Hopefully, we still love each other after the disagreement. Well, hopefully, we still love each other through the disagreement. But the point is, similarities can be persuasive, but similarities alone are not enough for an audience to find a source credible, or in this case, using the concept of believability, to find a source believable. They play a role, but alone, they are not enough. If any of these combine, and the more that are combined, right, then we see the credibility increasing, or believability. They would find a source credible. And even if they don't understand the message fully, have not been exposed prior to this message, not informed about the topic, they find this source believable, they're more likely to be persuaded. Well, I mentioned physical attractiveness helps. This is nothing new, right? Some of this stuff, you already know this. I mean, why do we always talk to high school students and to college students about first impressions and the way you dress, right? When you go for a job interview, that first impression. We know that physical attractiveness helps. It can help. Credentials, like similarities alone, are not enough. There may be people that, because of their credentials, you think they would have this overwhelming believability. But, as someone said, spoke at my graduation when I was hooded with my PhD down at Texas A&M, you may have the IQ of a zip code. The IQ of a zip code. But if you don't have integrity, right, you don't have anything. So a person's credentials may carry them in the argument, but they alone are not enough. I mean, compare and contrast here. So someone has really good credentials, right? Maybe they've got multiple degrees. I remember a friend of mine, sadly he's now deceased, but he had a bachelor's degree. I forgot what it was in. He had three, count them, 1, 2, 3 master's degrees. And a PhD. Well, if Roy were here and you knew of his credentials, but you disagreed with some other aspect of his political views, religious views, whatever it is, right? You would not necessarily be impressed by his credentials, or you might be impressed, but not enough to say he's a believable source. But let's say that you were originally from India and your parents sent you to a boys' school in England. You have that similarity. Let's say that you're attracted to him, not romantically or sexually, physically, right? But you're attracted to him because, I don't know, you dress alike. You have similarities. You like the same kinds of food, right? You can see here then, and you find him honorable and has goodwill towards you. Then credentials can carry him even further along when they're combined with other things. But credentials alone, right? I mean, think about your own experience. You can know that you're going to take a class. You've never taken a class with this professor before. What do you know about the professor? All these degrees, right? All these initials after her name or his name. All these publications, right? But if they come in and they're not a good speaker and not a good teacher, then their efforts to persuade you to do your best in the class, to come to class even, to pay attention in class and not be on Snapchat or Insta or whatever it is, right? They're going to fail. Credentials alone are not enough. Well, we also know that learning takes place regardless of the source, and this is a challenge for us when we're trying to persuade others. Even if you have a great deal of credentials, if you have similarities with an audience, you in advertising, and we'll look at this later in the session, In advertising, you've identified this target audience. You know what their vows are, the values and lifestyles, your demographics and psychographics. You understand the audience, right? And you attempt to persuade them of something, perhaps the reputation of the company, whatever it is. And there are competing sources, and that's a good thing. Sometimes it can be a bad thing if they're listening to your competition and not to you. Point is, learning takes place, and it's not always where we would expect it. There can be news story after news story, science story of the health risks of smoking. And people can be learning about the health risks of smoking that way. But if their daddy smoked, maybe their dad and their mom smoked, my dad smoked, all my uncles smoked, well, on my dad's side, right? I see their lives, I'm learning from them, and maybe even they live long lives, right? Well, I'm learning. You might say, well, wouldn't you learn more from the medical ad rather than from these people who said, well, there's the challenge, right? People can be learning from the news a lot about a candidate. But as the authors point out, they can be more easily persuaded by a negative ad than all the different content-filled news stories that they have heard. Learning is occurring regardless of the source. And there's always competition, which is a good thing between sources, but because persuasion is not a science and its outcomes can never be put down to a science and known with a great deal of certainty because so many variables involved, people might learn from the less likely source, or the source that we think they would be less likely to be persuaded by than the one they were more likely or thought more likely to be persuaded by. Well, just a couple more here. Ideas matter. What does that mean? Well, ideas can last longer than the knowledge of the sources from which the ideas came. Now, some of these things stick with us because we hear them from sources with high credibility that have been a part of our lives over a long period. So someone might say, my granddaddy used to always say, right? Or my mama always said, right? Mama always used to say. Okay, so there you remember the source. But because there are so many factors in believability, we know closeness to a source makes us more likely, in some cases, to believe the source and to be persuaded by the source, do what the source, remember what that source says. But there are other things, and I find myself doing this sometimes too, and it's often embarrassing because I expose myself to so many different messages and sources of information that I may have read a headline on some website or heard an author talking about something from his research in his book that was recently published, and he was on the John Batchelor show on the radio, right? And all this information, I find myself in a conversation with somebody say, learned something new recently about the Cold War and espionage, and when we had broken the Germans' Enigma code, and say, I said, really? That's fascinating. Where did you, I don't remember. I can't remember if I read that in a headline on CNN or Drudge Report, or where did I see? See, the point is, we for whatever reason, perhaps it's because Twitter and we're limited to characters, but we only remember so much, and what people tend to remember is ideas, not always the sources. So ideas matter, even if you forget the source, which is kind of scary because a lot of people run around perhaps spouting information that if we don't even remember the source, it might not bode well for whether or not we initially took time to examine the source to see if it was credible. Well, finally then, in the world of international relations and international affairs, sometimes you will hear people talk about countries and say the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if you have three countries, country 1, country 2, and country 3, and countries 1 and 2 are experiencing tension, well, depending upon the degree of that tension, right, if there's an attempt to build international support for country number one's position, or by country number two, international support for this. Took place in the Cold War all the time. Soviets and the Western democracies doing this. And say, well, country number three, right? They're not our allies. But in this case, if they want to be an enemy of country number two, then the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Perhaps we can create an alliance. And that can create all sorts of problems in international relations, right? There were countries that America was friendly with because they were anti-Soviet in the Cold War. They didn't have the best reputation in terms of their own government and authoritarian rulers and dictators, and that came back in some cases to haunt the United States. But at the time, they were willing to say the enemy of my enemy. If you're enemy of the Soviet Union, even though we may not be allies, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. What in the world does that have to do with source credibility? Well, you may experience difficulty in persuading someone of something because they are a different religion, political persuasion, whatever it is. And recently there was a story, and someone made a comment. Some celebrity, we'll look at legitimation in just a minute, some celebrity came out and made a statement. You say, I don't have anything else in common with that person. We're probably just about as dissimilar in our views of whatever, religion, politics, whatever else there is in the world. But about this topic, they said such and such. And in that case, suddenly this person that I had nothing in common with, right, I'm going to hold up as a great credible source. Why? Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That is to say, I may not agree with him in any other way except on this issue. They have credibility to some people because they're a celebrity, a politician, social leader, whatever it is. And they have said something that agrees with what I already feel. So suddenly, that person that on other issues may not be a credible source, right? Suddenly, they become a very credible source. Well, those audiences that are uninformed are ones who tend to be more heavily influenced by the credibility of the source of the message. And that's not necessarily a negative thing. We're not saying that they're ignorant and unwashed masses and they're easily manipulated and all those other negative stereotypes about persuasion. What is that to say? Well, when you are not as informed about an issue, you're listening to a person try to persuade you about something related to that issue. It's the first exposure, maybe the first time you've actually given it some thought. You might say, I tend to agree with them, not because I have done a great deal of research or studied the issue, but this person seems credible. But to break it down into a little bit more detail, again, it can be very complicated. This idea of credibility works on a continuum. So speakers have what is called initial credibility. That is, before we listen to a message, before we hear what they have to say, we already have some sort of image of them or some sort of impression of them, or we can find out something about them or the company or the candidate or the party the candidate is representing, etc. We can learn something about their reputation and build a degree of familiarity with them. So speakers can have a pre-message credibility or an initial credibility. And you can see as we go through here, credibility is not something that you can just sort of grasp and once you have it, you have it. It can be influenced over time and it can increase or decrease. Well, initial credibility is pre-message. Derived credibility is during the message. So, as the person is speaking or as the campaign is ongoing, as they're answering questions in an interview, we continue to judge their sincerity, whether or not they're competent. And you see these sort of gotcha questions sometimes in political campaigns where they'll ask some candidate, and it's been horribly embarrassing for people in various parties. What is the president of India's name or the prime minister of India? And they can't tell you what the, what, how are you going to be president of the United States, the most powerful nation in the world? You don't even know the man who's running India or Pakistan or whatever it is. And they may have had good credibility up to that time. Maybe even were demonstrating their competence in an interview up to that moment. And suddenly there's this sort of gotcha question. The issue becomes how much damage does that do? How much of their derived credibility do they lose? And does that even go back and erode the initial credibility that they have? But the more dynamic, the more charisma speakers have as they are communicating, the more credibility they can derive. Finally, then, just because a message has been communicated, perhaps you go to a rally or you watch a speech or you examine campaign advertisements, whatever it is, and you conclude that this source is credible, there are things post-message that can influence that. It's called terminal credibility. If people follow up with a candidate or a company post-message, there are things that can occur that could damage the credibility. Audience interactions, and you see this a lot of time with celebrities who may have a negative interaction with paparazzi, who may have tweeted something or said something recently. Show was canceled on ABC because a person tweeted something that was pretty disgusting. Well, as popular as the show was among viewers, suddenly this person has done something interacting with an audience via Twitter that destroyed her credibility. There are public events, and this is not a good thing. It's listed here as public events. These are incidents. So if a politician is found to be having an affair, the now prior governor of Missouri, who was the author of the Common Book that the university used, I guess, a year ago, 2 years ago, came and spoke at Tech, was given a medal from the Corps of Cadets because he had been a Navy SEAL, and great deal of initial credibility, great deal of derived credibility, even possessed a great deal of terminal credibility. Went on to run for governor of Missouri and was elected, and was apparently off to a good start until it came out that he had committed adultery, an extramarital affair, and then there were all sorts of accusations about pictures and blackmail and threats not to tell or be ruined professionally and politically and publicly. That's a public event. And those things can destroy terminal credibility unless a third party intervenes. Now notice here the third party. There's that idea harkening back to the rational legal standards. A third party. A third party is not necessarily somebody, a politician who's been caught having an affair, if his wife stands up and says, this is between me and my husband, or the woman, the husband comes and says, this is between my wife and I, well, that's different because that's the aggrieved spouse. When there are third parties that step in and say, well, on the one hand, this is the case. On the other hand, this seems to be the case. There can't be an intervention that counters. And again, we get to PR, we're going to talk about image restoration strategies, where terminal credibility is lessened because of something that has happened publicly. And there is an attempt to reestablish, in some ways this sort of cycles over again. Well, that's source credibility. Let's move to wrap up. And thinking about credibility as authority. What do we mean by credibility as authority? Well, take this first example, the idea of legitimation. Legitimation is something that people often turn to celebrities for, to legitimize their candidacy, to legitimize their company, to legitimize their product. When you think about Coach Beamer, former head coach at Virginia Tech, when he would do advertisements for local companies, Virginia, New River Valley, Roanoke Airport, right? He's respected within the community. He is a celebrity, a charismatic leader. If you'd ever heard him speak, you knew anything about the players and how much they loved him. Well, when he does an advertisement for Speedy Gas, whatever, gas station, Quick Mart, whatever it is, right? He's legitimizing them. You say, Frank Beamer pumps his gas there, right? Or buys his Monster Energy drink there, whatever it is, and gets 2 hot dogs for the price of 1. Whatever it is, he's legitimizing whatever it is that company is offering. It's good product or it's service, right? And this is why we've seen more and more celebrities going out on campaign trails. When a candidate asks them, will you come out? When they come out and speak on behalf of the candidate, they're legitimizing it. That is, they're giving it some because of their authority, their credibility with a particular audience. When they endorse something else, that there's sort of a transfer there. So it can be Katy Perry and oh, my mind just went blank. The facial cream that Proactive, Katy Perry and Proactive. She legitimizes that product for that particular target audience, teenage girls who both listen to Katy Perry and who have problems with acne, right? So they could say, here's Proactive. Use it. It'll help your complexion. When Katy Perry steps in and says, look, even me. And they show the picture of her up there in the infomercial. She's up there singing and they zoom in and there's a zit on her cheek. Oh no! Well, she says, I used Proactive. Guess what? It legitimizes. This is a legit product. It works. Helped me. It can help you. Okay? There's a transfer there of authority. What about mystification? Well, mystification goes back to this idea of the political use of language, right? Special symbols whose meanings are known only to a few. Technical jargon. The idea is those that can speak the language, so to speak, right, have a special authority. It's why if somebody sues you, you're going to go out and get an attorney. And you're going to say, hey, read all this stuff. I just got this in the mail, right? They said I had to sign for this. And yeah, can you explain all this to me, all this legalese? Right? They have a special authority. The joke that I like to use is, well, I guess part of it is a joke. You'll often hear on advertisements the admonition that we should always remind our doctors of all medications that we're taking. Or we should tell our pharmacist when we're getting buying something over the counter or having a prescription filled. Always tell the pharmacist all of the medications that you're taking. Why would we need to be told that? Well, somebody thinks we don't do it. The question would be, why do we not do it? Why do I feel the need when I go to my doctor, or why should I feel the need when I go to my doctor and he gives me a prescription for this sinus infection or whatever it is? Why would I feel the need to tell him, oh, by the way, doc, these are the medications I'm taking? Because I have ascribed to him a certain authority. There's a mystification involved in this process. I've ascribed to him a special authority, and I assume he knows all the medications that I'm taking, right? Why? Particularly if he gave me the prescriptions. Because have you ever read a doctor's prescription? Have you ever seen how they write? They hand me this thing and say, okay, we're going to prescribe this. And there's two or three different things we're going to tell you. Clear up this bronchitis and this chest cold and this sinus infection you have. And I can't read this chicken scratch. It's like Egyptian hieroglyphics. But I go to the pharmacist and I hand it to them and they say, oh, whatever, and whatever. Yeah, we'll have it filled for you. You want to wait for it? You want to come back? And my question is, how in the world did you read that? Did you take a class in deciphering a medical doctor's pharmacy scribble? Well, it's like they have this, right? This special language that they speak. And so we don't feel the need to say, hey, just by the way, I want you to know I'm taking this, and this, because they have this special authority. But they're human and they make mistakes too, sadly, sometimes even fatal when there are medical interactions or reaction to a medicine. But that's the idea of mystification. There's a special language that only they speak. And based on that, then we ascribe to them a certain authority. I mean, think about it. If I said to you, I'm going to talk to you today about subsynchronous rotor dynamics and heat exchange, you're like, what in the world is that? Subsynchronous rotor dynamics and heat exchange? And if I began to explain what that is in terms of mechanical engineering, right? You're just like, wow, we didn't know you were an authority on mechanical engineering. But if I went into a mechanical engineering class and said, I'm going to talk to you about subsynchronous rotor dynamics and heat exchange, the more I talk, the more they'd realize I only know the phrase and I don't know anything about those concepts, right? Credentials, what'd you get your degree in? Where'd you get your mechanical engineering, your ME degree? I don't have one. I have a BA in speech communication, a MA in communication studies, and a PhD in rhetoric and public affairs. Well, there goes my mystification, right? Moving right along, the two-step flow. sense of authority here is the idea of the middle man. As much information as I try to expose myself to and reading and staying informed, I can't be as informed as other people who have made that their full-time job. So they are in the media, opinion editorial writers, bloggers, whatever it is, and they have time to read legislation. Have you read the recent Supreme Court decision? No, I haven't. Will you take time? I don't think I'm going to have time. But I know that there are people I trust who have read that, and I trust them to tell me what is in it. Why? Because I've read their work in the past. I tend to agree with the things that they say, and I trust them as an opinion leader. They're writing about these things. They're studying these things. And when they tell me what a decision means, they tell me what's in the legislation. They tell me what's in the Supreme Court decision. They tell me what was in the dissent, who wrote the dissenting opinion, right? They're sort of the middleman, if you will, middle woman or woman between me and the source of information. And so they add authority to the information that I'm receiving because I have considered them a credible source. If they say it's a good Supreme Court decision, then I'm certainly much more inclined to think of it as a good decision, as opposed to initially thinking that it is a bad one. Well, source placebo suggestion. Powerful. Hopefully you know what a placebo is when you have a medication and you want to do trials with the medication. You've gotten permission from the Food and Drug Administration to do that. You have a control group, and you have a group that takes the medicine and a group that gets the placebo, right? What is the placebo? Typically just a sugar pill of some sort. But it's the idea that when you enter the trial that you're told, this is a trial for a drug that we think will have the following effects. A different example. I was reading a book about a man who, for Father's Day, wife and kids gave him a grill. So excited. Out in the garage, he's putting this thing together. He can't wait to grill for the family. Got it all assembled, got the tank hooked up. He's ready to light it up. So turns the gas on. He's got the thing, the clicker, and it's clicking, and it's clicking, and it's clicking, and it won't light. So he stops and waits, turns it off, turns the gas back on, click, 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 slot, not lighting. He's beginning to get lightheaded, right? So I shouldn't have been doing this in the garage because of the gas fumes, right? So gives up and goes and calls the company. He says, to help me troubleshoot. Here's what I'm doing. I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong. I can't get it to light. And they said, well, sir, you got this as a gift? They said, oh, yeah, got his Father's Day gift. He's so excited, he's going to put it together and give it. They said, well, you do know that the tank comes empty and you have to go down and get the tank filled before you can light your grill, sir? Ah! You see the power of suggestion. There was nothing in the tank, but the idea that I've got a grill. It's got a tank. Usually what's in the tank is what helps light the grill. It wouldn't light, so he's thinking. He's releasing gas into the garage. The power of suggestion. So sometimes just the power of suggestion, when these things, again, work together, not always mutually exclusive, the power of suggestion for what a product will do for you, just the suggestion. They don't even have to engage in false advertising or even make explicit claims that might be later falsified. The implication, that is implying the power of suggestion for what a certain product will do for you, can be powerful enough if we think it'll meet our expectations that we are persuaded. Well, finally, authoritarianism and acquiescence. Frightening in some ways when you think about credibility as authority. What did the Stanley Milgram experiments show us? And you can go to YouTube and you can type in Stanley Milgram experiments and you can find longer clips and shorter clips, depending upon your degree of interest. I won't take your time showing this clip here. But in the Stanley Milgram experiments, a source to whom people ascribed a great deal of authority in a particular study We want you to participate in the study. Here's what we're going to do. This is what the study's looking at. You need to follow the instructions of the person who's in the room with you and tell you what to do. Well, there's a person in another room, and they're asking that person a series of questions. If they get the question correct, get the answer correct, excuse me, everything's good. They get it wrong, they know they're hooked up to some electrodes, and they have to administer a degree of shock. Well, for each question they answer incorrectly, the shock, the degree of shock, electrically transmitted, increases. Its voltage increases. And as the experiment goes along, the person administering the shock, asking the questions, waiting for the answer, administering the shock if the answer is incorrect, here's the person in the other room, the other side of the wall, scream. And there were varying degrees of expressions of great pain. Now, no one was actually being shocked, but the person pushing the button administering the shock did not know that. And what was frightening about the Milgram experiments was what people were willing to do and how much they were willing to do, simply because a person that they thought was an authority was in the room telling them to do it. Well, it makes us wary of things like socialization, how much people are socialized to submit to authority. And particularly when we look back and we see not people, but peoples, entire countries. That's a broad brushstroke. Certainly not every German was a Nazi, and not every German or Nazi contributed to the extermination of vermin. But the idea that this person is an authority, for whatever reason they have concluded, credible, good for the country, this person is an authority. And so what this person tells us to do, we should do. We're going to wrap up with that, conclude, and we will come back to that idea when we get to propaganda, and we look at Nazi propaganda and propaganda used by today's radical Islamic terrorists, ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda, and how they play on this acquiescence to authoritarianism. But for now, that's all I got, Hokies. I'll look forward to being with you when we meet next time and begin our examination of Chapter 6 and the psychology of persuasion. Thanks for your time and attention. Let me know if you have any questions.